Well, it's that time of year again when we file our federal income taxes, and we have some interesting trends here at Gallup measuring Americans' perceptions of and reactions to paying taxes. Now, I'm going to review two of them for you. One of them is really ancient as polling goes. Dr. George Gallup first asked Americans back during World War II in 1943 whether the amount of taxes that you pay is fair or not. A very simple question. Now, that was the war. And at that time, we had in the high 80% of Americans who said, indeed, the amount of taxes they pay was fair. In fact, we had our all-time high, believe it or not, of 90% of Americans back in February of 1944. That was before D-Day, but in the middle of the war, who said the amount of taxes they paid was fair. Now, presumably, that was because during the war, Americans were very patriotic and realized that their taxes were going to help fund the war effort. That didn't last very long, and by 1946, the percent of Americans who said their taxes were fair was down into the 60% range. Then we didn't ask the question for a long time, but by the 90s, that percent had come down again. In fact, we had a period of time there where we had Americans more likely to say not fair than fair. You see that in front of you there. In 1999, only 45%, less than half of Americans, said the amount of taxes they paid was fair. Then came the Bush tax cuts, and we started asking the question again in 2003, and that percentage started to go up again. And we had, that is the percent of Americans who said taxes were fair, and as you see in front of you, consistently we've had a pretty high number of Americans saying the amount of taxes they pay is fair. Now, it's been dwindling down, but our most recent update that we just asked here in April showed about 55% of Americans saying the amount of taxes they pay were fair. So that's above water, so to speak, a majority saying taxes are fair. Now, different question. The amount of taxes you pay, too high, about right, or too low, that's a relatively new question. We just started asking that in the mid-1950s, but you can see in front of you, we've had a lot of variation there on the percent of Americans who say the amount of taxes they pay is too high, as opposed to about right. Now, very few Americans in our history have ever said the amount of taxes they pay is too low, so we can kind of throw that out. The real contention is between those who say about right and those who say that it's too high. And again, it's gone up and down consistently there for quite a period of time. Americans said the taxes they pay were too high. In fact, interestingly, the high point of every time we've asked it was 69% of Americans saying the amount of taxes they pay was too high. And guess what year that was in? 1969. Richard Nixon was president, and that was during the Vietnam War. Perhaps Americans were reacting to all that money that was being spent there. Then again, along came the Bush tax cuts and 9/11 after 2001, 2002, and the percent saying taxes were too high dropped precipitously, and it's been lower over the last decade or so. In fact, there have been several points in time where percent of Americans who said taxes were too high was slightly lower than about right. In other words, very good news in terms of taxes. And it's bounced up and down. In our most recent asking here, 50% too high, 45% about right. So we again, just like we had on the previous question, don't have a huge percent of Americans who are complaining about their taxes, about half, but clearly that's way down from where it's been previously. A couple of demographic breaks for you here. Republicans more likely to complain about taxes than Democrats. And the biggest age group that complains, those who are 50 to 64. That's where complaint about taxes is really high. When you're young or when you're retired, the percent saying taxes are too high is much lower. Bottom line out of all of this, on a relative basis, based on time, we're in a period where Americans are not nearly as likely to be complaining about taxes as they have at previous points in our U.S. history. I'm Dr. Frank Newport, Gallup Editor-in-Chief.